Now, let's talk to Jimmy Bobine, who is head of Augusto Consulting. He joins us virtually. Good morning, Jimmy. How are you doing?
Sorry, good morning, Ladi. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. Nice for you to join us, although the subject of discussion is not exactly pleasant. But I was just talking to Ini here in the studio, and we were taking a look at some of this issue of sanctions and how countries the world over are preparing themselves for the inevitable, ensuring that they are secure and that their people have enough to deal with, to grapple with, even while peace talks are going on. But let me begin with what, in your mind, what you're seeing with the effect of all these sanctions that have been placed on Russia and what Russia is attempting to do in return, and then, of course, all the other outside players in this battle. What do you make of the whole thing coming from an economic perspective?
Okay, from an economic perspective, Ladi, I think there's enough commentary really on the global picture, on the global happenings. So, if you do not mind, let's focus a bit on how this affects our dear country, Nigeria, right?
Absolutely.
And let's see how this is shaping out for Nigeria. Um, so first, the big story out there is oil and gas. And as you can see, oil and gas, you refer to that, oil and gas is at its highest in close to a decade, in about a decade, well over $100. And so the projections for the year is that it could do as much as between 80 to a wide band, if I may use, between 80 to $120 on the average for the rest of 2022. Ordinarily, Laddie, that should portend some level of comfort for Nigeria. Would that be good for global economic growth, especially on the back of all of the COVID recoveries? No. Okay. But like I said, if we have to narrow the narratives down to Nigeria, ordinarily that should be good for Nigeria. So, but on the back of that, we think that we'll expect higher FAC receipts this year. Nigeria should earn more from FAC this year on the back of the higher oil prices. We're looking at over 6 trillion from FAC. Federation account about 10 to 11 trillion. So federal government alone should be looking at about 5 trillion in FAC. Last year about 4 trillion, and then we're saying to ourselves that the federation account may earn as much as 10 to 11 trillion. However, why would Nigeria not be popping the champagnes to say that we're in a season of high oil prices once again, and high oil prices always portend good for the Nigerian economy? It's because we were not prepared for a time such as this. Okay, if I will just repeat it slowly again, Nigeria was not prepared for a time such as this. And why were we not prepared? We're going to be receiving oil revenues from our right hand. And like I said, the projection for this year is about 5 trillion for the federal government alone. But the downside is that with our left hand, we'll be giving out at about 4 trillion in subsidies if we maintain current subsidy levels. What do I mean by subsidies? I mean the downstream petroleum subsidy. All over the world, if you follow the narratives, especially amongst Nigerians in the diaspora, the big commentary today is gas prices, petrol prices have increased. But here in Nigeria, we faced a bit of supply shocks. Things are stabilizing. But one thing that isn't changing is the price at the filling station. However, all of the input costs, especially the raw material, the crude oil, has increased, but we're still buying petrol normally. So we're paying a dear price for it. And the price we're paying for it is that we're going to earn more in oil, but we're going to also spend more on subsidies for petrol. So it's nearly a scenario of minus one plus one, go back to zero. Okay.
That's frightening. That is frightening. But something else that has come up, of course, is the fact that between Russia and Ukraine, they produce quite a lot of important material for food and manufacturing industry. I was discussing yesterday with a guest who pointed out that a lot of ores and other metals that go into smartphones, that go into computer soft hardware and all of that come from those two countries. But I wanted us to focus on the one that has become obvious almost immediately, which is things like wheat and barley and manufacturing industries in the breweries and the baking industry, which produces bread, biscuits, and things like that. Again, from the narrow perspective you talked about earlier, the Nigerian perspective, we're already beginning to see the impact of this. And if this goes on for much longer than it has already, what do you see happening in terms of how this will impact on our economy?
So still on that narrow perspective, yes, computers, all of that, phone chips, all of that, yes, it's true. But when you're talking about the price of bread, a loaf of bread, then I think the issue of the rise in prices or the potential rise in prices of phone can actually take a bow. That kind of conversation can take a bow. Because what we're talking about here is the price of bread, the price of wheat. So what kinds of industries first can be affected? You've actually dimensioned it. So first the flour milling industry, and then that entire value chain within that wheat space, flour milling, bakery, confectionaries, those three major industries, and maybe drug manufacturing, whatever industry, breweries that may depend on additives from all of that wheat space. So Nigeria imports about a fifth of its wheat supply from Russia. Between Ukraine and Russia, you have about a third in production of global wheat. So what this means is that, and secondly, bread is one of the biggest staples in Nigeria. Remember, all of our local staples all have some level of seasonality. Yam, plantain, and even all of the maize meals, they typically have seasonality. So
That's right.
the major staple that doesn't suffer this seasonality effect, either upside or downside of seasonality, is bread. So bread is one of Nigeria's most important staples, even above rice, right? And as fate would have it, yes, there have been conversations, there have been initiatives and investments into increasing wheat production, but it hasn't just succeeded. So right now, we're still quite dependent on wheat for our local bread supplies, our local bread production, cakes, confectionaries, biscuits. Biscuits is another very reliable snack, especially for kids in Nigeria. So it's until you speak with a biscuit manufacturer before you realize and appreciate how much biscuit is a supporting meal, as a snack for kids. So we still are heavily dependent on Russia. Do we have alternatives? Yes, we have alternatives from the old Russian federations, all of the Eastern European countries. We actually do also import wheat from them, but it's lower variants of wheat, not as expensive as the Russian variants. But I think at this time we'll make do with whatever we have. Would it affect these industries materially? Oh, yes, it would. We're looking at prices of upwards of 30 to 50% in the tonnage price of wheat this year. How would that impact on bakeries? We already hearing the bread producers crying. And remember that the bread producers also have to struggle with twin effects of energy crisis. So if just yesterday there was a headline that the national grid collapsed and all of the electricity distribution companies are sending out forward apology notes that would not be able to meet supplies and all of that. So if you're a bread manufacturer, what that means is that you have to get off the grid and onto your own independent supply, which comes from a generator. Most likely, generator depends on diesel, depending on your scale. Diesel is not a subsidized commodity in Nigeria, so it enjoys market volatilities. It also suffers from market volatilities. So as a bread producer here, you're going to suffer the downside risk from increase in diesel prices. You're going to suffer the downside risk from increase in wheat prices, which would affect flour. Same with the cake manufacturer. And remember that in the flour milling space, and this is something that the narratives out there are picking right now, we have a very oligopolistic flour milling industry. And it's even grown more oligopolistic because flour mills just absorbed Honeywell, right? So you have about three major flour millers in the country today, one dominant flour miller in the country today, which means that wherever you have this kind of dominance, it's never good for clients to that dominant player. Okay, so but even at that, the flour milling industry, which has been very good at passing on costs of increased costs in wheat prices to bakeries, may actually suffer this year because we think that this is the year where bread producers will snap. What would it lead to? We may see it could potentially, and I'm being very careful about these doomsday scenarios, it could potentially affect the health, viability, and going concern status of small and vulnerable bakeries. Secondly, it could also potentially affect the quality of bread. Remember that the bakery business in Nigeria is quite fragmented, and the ability of NAFDAC to provide regulatory oversight on the bakery industry due to the level of fragmentation is quite challenged. So what that means is that what's the quality of bread from a bakery that is struggling to survive, struggling on energy costs, struggling on bakeries? What kind of ingredients will they start to use to just survive? It'll be an interesting question, and an agency like NAFDAC would have to raise its game to ensure that we're not eating the kinds of things we're not supposed to eat because companies just have to stay afloat or bakeries just have to stay afloat.
This is frightening. This is frightening stuff. I wanted, of course, to ask you. We'll take a break. When we come back from that break, I'm going to still have you with us because I have one more thing to ask about, and that has to do with aviation. We know that the aviation industry now is on the verge of a shutdown, an accumulation of several problems which have now been exacerbated by the difficulties, the disruptions in the supply chain as a result of this battle. So please stay on with us, Jimmy. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us. Welcome back. Jimmy Ogbobene of Augusto Consulting is still with us. Thank you for your time. As I said before we went on the break, there's still one more issue which is likely to impact on quite a number of us, and that is the aviation industry. For about a week now, its operators have said that given the situation, even the regulators have now said that given the situation, that industry may have to shut down. This is something else that will have a big economic impact. We're hearing, though, that a kind of reprieve has come in the sense that for the next 2 or 3 days, the NNPC says it will provide aviation fuel to them at 500 naira, but that's only for the next 3 days. A more fundamental problem is still on the ground, and that's been exacerbated by this Russian invasion of Ukraine. How do you see that playing out?
For the aviation industry, I have a sense of empathy for that industry for one major reason. If you remember, at the peak of COVID in 2020, the aviation industry was one of the most affected. The aviation industry, hospitality, because planes were entirely grounded, airports were grounded, shut down, and all of that. So the aviation industry, to be fair to them, are still reeling on the back of the COVID. And they are still in recovery phase, but whatever growth that industry has recorded in the last year and good projections we're looking out for in 2022 hasn't still taken them back to, say, 2019 levels. So that's one issue we need to consider. Now, the second issue we need to also consider is, on one hand, we clamor for free pricing, market-driven economy in things like in the energy space, particularly petrol prices. On the other end, when we see the reality of free market, sometimes we balk and we're asking for controls all over again. We're asking for a command structure. So what NNPC is doing here is to increase the fiscal hole that we have seen. We talked about a 4 trillion naira figure for 2022. for petrol subsidy. That 4 trillion naira figure doesn't include subsidies for aviation. Now, for aviation, the reality is this. If we want to reform, then we should reform. If we do not want to reform, then let's have a different conversation. Aviation ticket prices should reflect all of the costs. There are no controls there. There are no controls. So if your input cost goes up, then I think that should reflect on the prices. So the problem here is, if you look at it from, especially from a consulting perspective, the aviation industry prior to this time has not conducted itself in such a manner that it can easily pass on cost to consumers. So you have incidents of people waiting for 10, 12 hours in airports, and there's no reprieve, no sanction from either the regulators or from the aviation industry, or from the operators. So Nigerians have lost confidence in the aviation sector prior to this time. And the effect of that loss, that confidence erosion in the industry prior to this time, is that the industry then suffers in its ability to pass on cost to consumers. Because ordinarily, an issue of this nature should reflect in higher prices of air tickets. But the industry has consistently lost passengers due to the underlying morass in that industry. You have more people today who, who are saying to themselves, why would I wait 12 hours in an airport because of flight delays when a road trip would have taken me 4 to 5 hours or 6 hours or even at most 9 hours? You have people who say, someone else called me as at the time I got to the airport, he had arrived in Abuja and I was still in the airport in Lagos. So that industry has consistently lost passengers due to these fundamental issues. So at a time like this, they are now struggling. And let's also remember that the world in 2019, prior to COVID, is not the world we know today. Ladi, if this were pre-COVID, I would have been in your studio talking to you face to face. But today, there are higher efficiencies on both parties. I'm not stuck in traffic. I'm not travel time. I've saved travel time, increased efficiency. I'm right at my desk speaking to you. And 2 minutes after this meeting with you, this session with you, I'm back at work. I'll do the same thing for a client in Yola, for a client in Kano, a client in Port Harcourt, a client in Abuja, such that it has limited interstate travel, and even travel across the continent. The aviation industry needs new thinking. The aviation industry needs increased efficiency. It needs better customer service, because, like Nigeria as a whole, the aviation industry was not prepared for a time like this.
Indeed, I guess this situation, the double whammy, if you like, of this invasion of Ukraine and then what has happened with COVID before that is now coming. The chickens, as they say, are coming home to roost now. We'll have to keep watching those. But I want to thank you, Jimmy Ogoboni, for your time today. Jimmy is the head of
Thank you
Augusto
very much,
Consulting.
Adi.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.